Welcome to the Digital Tabletop Fest Wargames games panel. My name is Robey Jenkins. I'm from Precinct Omega, which is an independent tabletop games designer. We are developing what's called the Horizon Wars intellectual property and have started with a tabletop miniature skirmish game called Horizon Wars Zero Dark, which is available now from Wargame Vault. Having done my little bit, it's now my job as the moderator of this panel to introduce the other panel members, and I'm going to ask them all first to tell us who they are, where they work, what they're working on, but also, if they can remember, to tell us the war game they most recently played for fun instead of business. So if I can ask our first panel member to introduce himself. Jan, would you kick us off?
Hey, my name is Jan Wagner, and I'm running Owned by Gravity, which is a digital studio, a recent title being Fantasy General 2, sort of a remake of a 20-year-old or follow-on to a 20-year-old title that we did. And I'm also running a board game studio, which is called Underground Games, and our recent title on that is Jagged Alliance, the board game, which is a computer game that we made into a board game instead of the other way around. The most recent game that I've played for fun, that's at least technically is Baldur's Gate. The reason I don't play war games for fun is that I always look at them in terms of what did the other guys do, how much better are they, what do we need to learn in order to improve. So it's hard to play them for fun anymore. It's like watching TV with a cameraman. You always kind of look at it differently. So yeah, Baldur's Gate's the one I've played for fun.
That's great. Thank you, Jan. We'll move straight on to James with a fantastic collection of games behind his head. There's got to be one on there that you've been playing recently.
Oh yeah, I'm James. I'm director of Evil Twin Artworks. We've made war games for quite a long time now. We've created Man of War Corsair for Games Workshop, and we've been working on the Victory at Sea franchise. The last game we made was Victory at Sea Pacific, and our new one, Victory at Sea Ironclad, which is set in the American Civil War, will be out relatively soon. We'll be announcing that at some point. We've been we love our board games and war games, so it's been tough, obviously, with all the restrictions and things. Just before the lockdown, we got the new version of Avalon Hill's Dune by Gale Force 9, so we've been playing that online as well because it's got the kind of the troops movement and the kind of the ruthless nature of war games, so it's nice to be taking hostages and assassinating generals and getting traitors and things like that. So it's like, yeah, hours of fun for everybody.
Excellent. And last but absolutely by no means least, John up in Scotland. What are you up to?
Hi, I'm John. I'm Chief Operations Officer at Hunted Cow, and for the last 3.5 years, we've been working with Games Workshop to bring the old world to life in our cross-platform game, which is Warhammer Chaos and Conquest. Since May, our launch last year, we've had like 1.2 million players join the battle. And just last weekend, we announced the new Invasion of Ulthuan expansion, where you're going to now take your Chaos troops from the old world and travel to the High Elf region of Ulthuan, because you're not happy just slaughtering humans, you need to slaughter the elves as well. In terms of tabletop, I'm actually a big gamer. Warhammer 40,000 was the last game I played. My chapter is Space Marines, Blood Angels, and kind of passionate about them, really excited with the 9th edition of Warhammer 40,000, actually.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's introduced our panel for today. And we're going to move on, and I'm going to present some questions and just invite members of the panel to share their thoughts. Let us know what they think on the subjects we're talking about. Of course, we're focused on war games today, but we're very much looking at the interplay between digital war games and tabletop war games, and also, to an extent, on how that relationship has changed or developed in the course of the recent lockdown. So, first of all, just to sort of kick us off, digital war games obviously are a growing, increasing market, particularly as people are forced to spend more time at home. But the venerable tabletop hobby persists and in some ways is even thriving, even under lockdown. So as players of both digital and tabletop games, what do you think attracts a player to favour one or the other? And I'll point that first of all at John.
Okay, so in recent times, yeah, I think you're right. There has been a large surge in popularity of like the board and tabletop games. I think it's to do with like the social interaction and the camaraderie you can get out of that, and maybe friendship as well. Like developing friendship around these shared hobbies is really powerful. I'm going to use Warhammer as an example because obviously I make it and I play it, and I think the universe is very full of lore and depth. So someone who starts on a board or a video game, it can be very easy to transition from one to the other. In terms of like what elements of design are shared between both, I think you can find fun and you can find strategy, and I believe these are like key components of, I guess, both of them. And as a wargamer player myself, I know I spend way too much time like looking at army lists and strategies. And I think when we were designing our digital game, we were kind of trying to think like that, like, so players, what would they like to do in a digital Warhammer game? And yeah, I just want you to understand that I think there's strengths in both genres, and I don't think they literally compete with each other. They're not mutually exclusive, and I think players can get joy out of both.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things that the digital world makes a lot easier. One is rules. You don't need to know them. You need to understand the strategies, obviously, but you don't need to do the dice rolling, do the calculations, and do the modifiers and everything else. So in this way, I think digital war games are much more comfortable to play, allowing you to sort of focus on different things and then not forgetting that modifier or something. And this is, I think, where they're really strong. And the other thing is overview, which I think, funnily enough, is a little harder. You can deep down dive into information in most digital war games, but you don't see the whole table most of the time because you're limited to the screen. So there's a lot of scrolling around, and especially I noticed that a lot of digital war games kind of have a front where they're sort of close together, and we had that problem as well when we were designing it. That you don't want players to sort of be all over the place because then they're losing the connection to what's the action on the screen, and vice versa. In one of the things I think tabletop war games have improved a lot in is production value. Obviously, Games Workshop and Warhammer were always kind of up there in that regard, but there's been a huge improvement in the way war games look and feel, and I think that attracts more people to the hobby as well, because previously when you had a war game, you kind of had numbers and counters on it with ideally black-white hexes, and that put off a lot of people from even trying them, even attempting them. And I think the recent resurgence of board games in general has helped the whole idea of board games not being something that is ugly and hard and difficult, but they can really be nice on the eye and haptical as well.
Awesome. James, have you got any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I tend to agree that there's pluses and minuses for both. I think there's a certain level of for us with Victory at Sea, one of the great things is that we were creating a game that has got a lot of back end rules that the player doesn't need to worry about. So when they play the game on the PC, it's the top level strategies and things like that they can look at. But I think there's always there's always room for people to come and play together and be social in both ways. I think for me, still draws me to the tabletop. The physicality of it is the creativity behind it as well. I love to paint miniatures and things as well. So
I'm really glad you touched on that, because I'd literally just written this down here. I'd written creativity because I know, John, you're obviously a Warhammer player, and I can see BattleTech on the shelves behind you, James. Jan, do you play miniatures games as well, or are you strictly a board game guy?
I do play miniatures games, but I'm more leaning towards board games simply because the miniatures gaming, without being able to paint properly, which I'm totally not, is much less fun to get with your grayed out army into all the colorful enemies that you see. So I've kind of limited myself in that regard.
There is
Well, I'd be really
the Citadel contrast paints you can go for.
Oh,
now as
yeah,
I
well.
know.
yeah, changing the game.
Believe me, I know. I've tried and I've failed.
Do you know, I'd be really interested to know, speaking to you all with your sort of digital designer heads on, to know whether digital war games have tried to capture some aspect of that creativity that obviously draws people to the miniatures hobby. Anybody want to chime in on that one? Go ahead.
It's funny because we've literally last week we've talked about one of the things that we don't have, which is we can't change the visuals of the units that we have in our game. We've got by now we've got about 100 different units, and in order to be able to identify them, they need to have a distinct look. Otherwise, you've got, if you paint them yourselves on the digital screen, it'll really hard to understand what's happening there.
And so this is in Fantasy General 2.
This is in Fantasy General 2, yes.
Yes.
There's an add-on just out, Empire Flame, which adds more units even. Actually, that's probably out when this airs. And we wanted to have a feature where you could define your colors other than just sort of the shoulder color, like blue, red player colors as well. So there's a lot of limits to what you can do, and we looked into how could you actually increase the creativity like you do in a lot of RPGs, where you can create your own character and you can choose a face and hair and styles and everything, and that leads to one of the problems that in a physical game you always know who your units are, like these guys are mine, I can tell. In digital it's much harder, and I think that needs to be the next level, actually. That kind of creativity that you see in RPGs or in MMOs, where you have one character or 6 characters, something that you can identify. We need to see how that can be transferred properly, while still retaining identifiers like player color and like basic shape of the unit that tells you, okay, this is that kind of unit I need to be understanding. Is that an archer or is that an infantryman? And I need to see that immediately. But still, I want stuff like people creating their own banners, stuff like that could be interesting. I think that should be something that we look forward to.
Has anybody else got a chime in on how digital game designers try to capture that element of creativity, perhaps in ways that don't necessarily involve sort of changing the figures, but is there any other aspect to the game that you can engage a player's creativity in what the products are doing?
Yeah, well, we obviously, one level will actually, like I said, having that top end, the back end of it not actually being seen by the player. Of course, that changes when you give them mods. So, we've so you can be really creative. With Victory at Sea Pacific, we've got some amazing modders because obviously we initially created the game to be because it covers the whole Pacific. So it was a massive experimental undertaking for us to think, how the hell do we make this, capture the Pacific War? And one of the things we realised we needed to be a bit punchier with it, and a bit faster, obviously, because we're not making a proper like grognardy sort of experience. But actually, some of the mods we've got are ultra realistic, and they've turned the battles to take hours rather than minutes, and things like that. And it's that sort of level of creativity there, and just being able to discuss it with these players. We talk on Discord to some of the modders, and it's just fascinating to see the research and the things that they've been taking on and the challenges to actually create to turn Victory at Sea Pacific into something completely different to what we imagined when we first started.
And John, you're obviously working with a Warhammer property, which is absolutely embedded in the tabletop hobby. Are there sort of expectations from the license holder, Games Workshop, that you do include some sort of levels of creativity for the player to get engaged with?
Yeah, so I think we've definitely done some. Our game's a bit different in that it's actually a massive... it's not an MMORPG, but it is massive multiplayer, as in all the players persist within one server. They can all see each other, they can communicate, they can all fight each other. So we're a little bit more limited there in terms of mods or whatever, but we do have certain degrees of creativity within the game. Like guilds can create their own guild banners, and you can see these banners hanging over the walls of your keeps. We also have quite an in-depth item system. And then there's about, I think last time there's about 300 different stats in our game. It took a lot to take the tabletop into a digital product for us. So there's a lot of creativity that the players can work around, and like they have created this whole like meta level within the game, and it's always shifting, and we're always trying to like keep up with them almost. Like they almost know the game as well, if not better than us at this point. Because they're on it like 24 hours a day, every day, right? And like we have jobs and stuff that we have to do, you know, like they want new things in the game. But yeah, it's a really interesting question actually. Within working with Games Workshop, obviously, like in terms of like, I don't think we could go and like change the color of a demon without asking them or something, right? But yeah, I think maybe adding some more creativity is a very interesting avenue. Like you said, like as a tabletop gamer, there's obviously like a very tactile element to that, right? You have the model in front of you, and you're totally free to do whatever you want with that model. Hey, you don't like his head, whatever, you just change it. But maybe in digital, it's really interesting. We actually did get to create some unique characters for our game that had never been seen before within the Warhammer universe. And I think we created like a female Chaos Champion because we wanted to like represent rather than just be like Warhammer. Like if you look at the models, apart from like the recent battles,
they're getting a lot better. I'll give them credit; they're improving.
There was a lot of, you know, like the Chaos world, I guess, is very dominantly male, and we wanted to just address that and be like, yeah, as a player, you can choose. So, trying to, yeah, I think we're trying, and maybe we can do some more. This is very enlightening, actually.
I'd be interested now. We've kind of all, and obviously, I prepared questions for the panel, and we've really sort of started to dig into the next question already, and I think that's going to be true throughout the panel. So one of the things I was interested in is asking you guys who've got a foot in both worlds, speaking as someone who's very much embedded in the tabletop side of design, to articulate what the differences are between designing a game for tabletop versus designing a game for a digital platform. And we've already talked about that creative aspect, and John just hit on the tactile element of the tabletop game, where it's got that haptic feedback of moving stuff around a tabletop. And Jan started us right at the beginning. He threw himself straight into one of my questions before we'd even started, talking about how the rules in a tabletop game, you have to learn them and absorb them. But in a computer game, they're set up there for you already, and you can just dive straight in. Other than those, then, just to sort of make sure I'm still drawing something out of this question, what do you think are the key design principle differences between the tabletop design process and the digital game design process? And I'll throw that one first, if I may, to James.
Well, I think in terms of Victory at Sea, obviously that they're actually based on tabletop war game rules as well. Warlords just published the latest version of Victory at Sea, and yeah, obviously it's that immediacy in a computer game where you can actually, you know, you can send fleets out and they start to move. Where, you know, with regards to tabletop, you know, it's a more of a turn-based thing. So it's interpreting the speeds and the way things work. We try to keep as much of the stats as pure as possible with the actual tabletop version. But sometimes it does, you know, well, when we did Man of War Corsair was a great example with Games Workshop. The orcs had I can't remember now. If you ever played Man of War, I think it was the orc ships are so badly made. There was you know, if you rolled a 6, say for instance, they just sink. But from a player's experience, if you've got a massive orc fleet coming towards you and you just watch them slowly sink, there isn't the same sort of feedback there. For, you know, you just think, what's going on? Is it broken? You know, so
I'll be honest, it was pretty heartbreaking when you were playing Man of War in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same sort of thing with Blood Bowl. Is that you know, it's great to roll. I think some of the best fun I've had in Blood Bowl, the tabletop version, is the disastrous rolls that can happen, and watching your teams just getting completely bone crunchingly killed and crushed left, right, and centre. But sometimes you need to, you know, from a player's experience, unless you're actually bringing the dice rolls in and showing them, you know, like in Baldur's Gate or something like that, where you have the dice rolls come in and start rolling on the table. You know, you kind of need to interpret the back end a little bit more. You know, be a bit more flexible with it.
And I suppose that designing for the digital game gives you that flexibility. You know, as a tabletop designer, I am constantly constrained by the fact that my only tools are a few pieces of paper, a pair of dice, and what I can fit on a 4x4 table. Whereas when you're writing for a digital game, you've got a huge amount more flexibility, more freedom for the space within which you're designing. Do you have to place constraints? Because obviously I'm pre-constrained. It's quite easy for me. I know what my limits are the moment I start working on a game. Whereas for you guys, you don't know what those limits are on a digital design process. How do you go about setting those constraints to make sure that you keep your game within a manageable framework? And I'll throw that one, because he's already started it. I'll throw that one at Jan, if I may.
I was just saying, I mean, you've just mentioned the constraints, right? It needs to be manageable. It needs to be understandable. It's not a physical table, but it still needs communicating. It's not rules that you need to learn, but you still need to understand it. And one of the things that James just mentioned was that you don't see the role, so you don't necessarily see what's happening. You just see the result. So, you know, somebody falling over. Why did that happen? What did I do in order to be able to, you know, make that happen again? So a lot of the stuff that, because it's a step-by-step process in tabletop, and it's not in, or it's less interesting to watch that step-by-step process. Let's put it this way: in a digital game, you need a lot of different feedback mechanisms that you don't have to think about in tabletop. You know, do you see them? Do you see somebody firing? Do you see where the missile's hitting? Do you see if it's hitting critically or not? Do you see what the wound results are? Can I now change is the unit wounded? How do I display that? Of course, you can have little bars above the head, but you always need a graphic support to that. And that's on the one hand. So the action can get very complex without a lot of flow to show you necessarily by itself what it does. So you need to visualize a lot. And the other part is, I think the constraint is, or the lure is to always put in more, because you can so easily. John mentioned they've got like 300 stats in the game, which is insane. Like, if you look at the tabletop and do that, and you've got 300 stats, nobody would be able to manage that and balance that properly. The digital can do that for, like, it's not scared by numbers. But then you tend to, first of all, you have a feature creep that comes in easily, where you go, oh, we can add this and can that and that. And then you can also get into, I think, the trap of what we call minor modifications, where you go like, okay, because it's so realistic, I can do a plus 0.5 to this, and if you come from the left, then you get a plus 0.7, and this and that and that, and then you add a lot of modifiers, and it all evens out into, I, as a player, don't feel what's happening. I can understand it if you give me a chart of what's happening, but I don't see, I don't really relate to what I'm doing. So I think these are the constraints: being able to communicate what's happening, being still focusing on recognizable effects that you do have, that you can replicate. Like in Fantasy General, if you walk into wood, you see the figures are hidden. You see a little display that you're hiding now, and you can do an ambush. And if you've got a special ambushing unit, then you can do extra damage. All this is displayed, and all that is visualized, and it's reliable and repeatable, and you understand the system. But it's still something that, as a player, you need to be taught, you need to learn, and then you need to apply it. And if you have 50 of those things, they all just get one big great glob of something's happening. I don't know why. Now he's dead. And that's something that you need to look at, because you don't have all the communication that you have in a tabletop, where there's a shared rule system by everybody, and where you can see step by step how the action evolves.
Something, oh, now I'm dead sounds a lot like my experience of EVE Online, I have to say. So, John, I know you've all worked with license holders. I'm picking on John because he is, in with Games Workshop right now. I mean, do they place constraints upon what you can do, other than the obvious visual and aesthetic ones?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's two parts to answer. One is they really like, I think one thing that we wanted to do anyway as Warhammer players, we wanted it to feel that, like, if you have like a Chaos Troll and you've played the board game and you know what a Chaos Troll does on the board game, then when you come to the digital game, you kind of want to just straight away go like, oh, this is the Chaos Troll, this is what he does. They are the same. The difference that I guess we have is our game's an always online game, and you're playing this game for, like, we're 18 months in. I think we'll hopefully go for many years to come, and all the time you're trying to build your army bigger. You're basically trying to create the giantest chaos warband with your allies that you can. So while you may start with one chaos troll, 18 months down the line, maybe you've got 1,000 chaos trolls, which you would never have on the board game, right?
Oh God, I can only imagine. There's probably somebody out there that's tried. It's going to happen. Do you know? It's actually, that's a really good point, because you're talking about that transition from the tabletop to the digital platform now, particularly in the Warhammer setting, but I think across the board. Obviously, we're 6 months into lockdown. It's eased in some places, it's ramping back up in other places, but it's definitely still a major crimp on the ability of tabletop gamers to meet with friends, to socialize, to play that kind of interactive face-to-face game. Have you, because John didn't get as much to say in the last one, I'll throw it straight back to you. Have you seen a noticeable increase in interest in your products over the lockdown period? And is there evidence that that's the tabletop crowd seeking the same hit through a digital medium?
Do you know what? I can't say if it is the same crowd, but we have seen a noticeable increase in terms of, like, installs and exposure for the product. Yeah, I mean, I feel that the gaming market is so vast that, like, if new players come and engage with our title, there's so many other titles that they can engage in. And I think I said it before, I don't think the digital or the tabletop is mutually exclusive. But yeah, I mean, our game has certainly been healthy these last few months. I mean, I guess, like everybody, we had questions at the beginning of a lockdown, but yeah, it's been good, and I think we're continuing to grow. And I think that the expansion that we just announced is super exciting. If you haven't checked out the trailer, yeah, it's awesome. I think it's the best work we've ever done in our studio, so we're super happy with it, and we're looking forward to the future of the game, really.
Feel free to repeat the name of the game now, just so anybody who's watching this panel can go and do a quick YouTube search and have a look at that trailer.
Warhammer Chaos and Conquest. You'll find it on Steam, and I think you'll find the new trailer on Steam as well now.
So, what about you, James? Have you seen any sort of evidence that an uptick in interest in your products is coming out of the tabletop market?
I think, again, like John, I think it's one of those ones that's kind of hard to pin down in that respect. We have seen an uptick, and I think, just a lot of people want a lot more things to do, as well. So it's kind of it's a difficult one, I think, to really pin down. But I think I certainly have been trying, even when there are options, we've been trying to get Star Trek RPG off the ground. Some friends of mine, and so looking at Roll20 and all those sort of things as well. So there's different routes into, to approach these things. But over the years, we've always found people. We found it going the other way, where we've had people buy the game, and so I didn't realise it was a tabletop game as well. And with Victory at Sea, and went and looked at the Victory at Sea, because they just want more of it then. It's just, I need more content, I need more things to do. And I think it's the same the other way around, where we have had in the past people come up and say, I used to play the board game and the tabletop games and whatever else, and this is really, scratched an itch that, because again, I suppose it's the scale. You can get away with it with scale and things like that as well. So, and especially, as you said, for those that not so good at painting the miniatures, it's certainly a quicker, a more immediate hit for that sort of thing.
It is something of a virtuous circle, I suppose, isn't it? As they get drawn to one hobby or the other. So where you've got crossovers, it's going to push people towards the other hobby to find that, like you say, that extra content. That we want more material, we want more time, we want more information and different ways to engage with the same kind of settings, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we're sort of talking around the same. I mean, obviously, because of the properties that some of you are working with, we've talked about Games Workshop setting quite a lot. We've got Victory at Sea, which of course is a World War II setting. Do you think there are specific either intellectual properties or historical periods that are particularly good for Wargames? And if so, what is it about those that make them the best settings for you? And seeing as he was a bit shortchanged on the last question, I'll throw that one back at Jan.
That's a bit hard for me to say. I think almost everything can be made, or every era can be made in a wargame, and we're talking about fantasy wargames as well, like that don't actually have an era. Like they're pretend medieval, but in terms of if you look at the units that they're facing, like Fantasy General, we've got aerial units which could be bomber planes and fighter jets for all. Like tactically, they work.
It's classic high fantasy, isn't it? Fantasy General.
It's pretty much high fantasy.
Yeah, it's all the highfalutin, every conceivably beautiful, mad creation that can exist is there.
Which is interesting because it allows you sort of to break the boundaries of certain eras and just go like, we really like aerial units because we like them from a gameplay perspective. So it's going to be dragons and things dropping rocks. Instead of
giant eagles and pegasi and all sorts. Yes, yeah.
So that's interesting, but still, I think in terms of war games, for some reason, World War II is still the most popular genre or era to place it in. I think it's because it's on the cusp of just having all the sort of modern era units. So you've got air, you've got ships, you've got panzers and tanks and stuff like that, but not as remote. It's still very direct. Then if you look at modern warfare, if you replayed that, like half of it is going to be pushing a button and sending a drone or an aerial strike, and that's it. You don't get the immediacy anymore. So I think World War II is at the cusp of that, and classically, a huge amount of the war games that exist have been set there. Funnily enough, if you look at digital war games, they have opened up the genre much more than board games. By now, board games sort of followed suit, but I think because the World War II games aren't that colorful, because if you want to be realistic and there's a certain type of realism is required, you're getting into trouble at a certain point with variety, because one tank pretty much looks like the same across different and I'm going to be stoned by World War II enthusiasts here, but it is
not wrong.
It has a distant lack of variation, and all the fantasy stuff can do that much better. Even ancient battles are more interesting because you get colored shields and all that. So I think with digital, that kind of opened it up more than the board games had before.
Now, James, if I'm right, Victory at Sea is a World War II setting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I mean, other than obviously you're working with a pre-existing property, what is it about Victory at Sea that that World War II gives the designer that makes it so appealing?
Again, I think, as I said, the new game Ironclad is set in a civil war, so I think the designer's been looking at various other ages, in that respect. But yeah, I think one of the things, the Civil War, so much more harder to find all the details, and actually, you go and talk to people, and there's arguments as to whether certain ironclads or ships had these sort of features and how these features are set up, and so there is some of the information is spotty in that respect. So World War II's got that sort of there's everything there. It's it's still it's a grind to get all the information, but the information's there for you. But I think that with regards to I completely agree with Jan. Is that that we have looked at and maybe we'll do it down the line. Going into a more modern setting, but suddenly the distances and the scale changes so much. You could be I was looking at the stats for the Challenger 2 tank, the longest tank-to-tank hit, and I can't remember. It was ridiculously long. And you think, is it all the computer technology and all the detail, the things behind these things, suddenly do detach you into and put put challenges on the game that actually aren't there in the World War II setting, and certainly not in the Ironclad setting. Whereas actually with World War II, one of the problems we had was that because we went for the whole Pacific, we wanted to automate as much as we could, so the player could send in fleets, and get them in as if they were individual units, like in Total War or something. When I wrote Horizon Wars, which is a battle game, a 6mm scale battle game, my father, who's an ex-Royal Marine, said, "Well, why don't you write a sci-fi naval game?" And I said, "Dad, because sci-fi naval tabletop's going to be the most boring game in history. You're going to need to have 2 separate tables, and all you're going to be doing is to seeing, can I shoot the person on the other side of the horizon? There's nothing else to it at that point." Well, John, so I was just making sure we get everybody in. John, obviously working with a pre-existing intellectual property means that you always have to look over your shoulder and make sure that the property owner is happy with what you're doing. But does it give you a lot of advantages to come with a pre-packaged piece of property to work with that doesn't have the same sort of historical rigor demands that the American Civil War might, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I've made like 5 or 6 games now at 100 Cow, and having something as rich as Warhammer can actually take like quite a degree of ease off creating original content. I mean, I guess in some ways that's like coming back to World War II. That's why I think World War II resonates so well with players, because like a Tiger tank is stronger than a Sherman tank. These are very simple things to understand, and then you can very quickly get into the product, right? So I guess I think the same is for like with Warhammer. If players are familiar with all the units from the old fantasy game, then when they come into our game, they're obviously very easy to get into. They know exactly what they're getting. But yeah, I think as well, Warhammer is so rich. Like in some ways, we're a little bit spoiled with it. Like there's so many units, there's so many races. I mean, I think we could probably work on this game for another 10 years and not run out of things to choose from. So in that sense, as a designer, there's plenty of other things still to design within a game, right? Having someone that's just giving you all the units or all the stats, you're almost thankful of that. Really, is like, yes, I can use all this, and I can still feel like I'm progressing, or still feel like I'm getting a win, so to speak.
I think, and mostly my job here is just to ask you guys questions and to give you excuses to be interesting. But before I was designing games, I had a civilian job, and before I had a civilian job, I was actually in the armed forces myself, and we had to spend quite a lot of our time studying military history, and World War II was a major focus for us. And I think what I've sort of learned from that time that I spent both studying and having to apply those lessons is the enormous appeal of World War II, both as a field of study and as a source for game designers of every stripe, I think, is the sheer scale and scope of warfare that it represented in a way that I think today, even with modern wars to draw upon, I don't think we can truly appreciate. The fact that there were conflicts going on in the jungles of Burma and in North Africa and across Europe and in the Pacific Islands, all at the same time, that the variety of different environments, different tactical and strategic challenges that presented to commanders, and the sheer logistical magnitude of what World War II represented to human civilization is something that I think is going to be a really rich vein for game designers to continue tapping into. I think almost for longer than Warhammer will be, in my opinion. We'll see. Anyway, I must get back to the actual questions and stop answering my own questions for me. So I'd like to sort of try and turn away from your roles as designers now for a moment and think of have you think of yourselves as players and the appeal to you of war games. And because I know you all play games both as hobbies and have now made the design of war games your professions, I know you must have some kind of passionate draw to this as a genre. So I'd like you to sort of articulate what it is about war games particularly, rather than role-play games or abstract games or first-person shooters or whatever. What is it about the war game that draws you to it? And the sort of the two extremes in my mind are, on the one hand, the tactical puzzle that must be solved, and on the other hand, the grand spectacle of warfare unfolding before you. Now, and you may think there's something else in there, or there may be somewhere between those two extremes, but tell us what it is that has drawn you to make a profession out of war games. And I'm going to pick on James first to answer that for us.
I mean, well, I think my brother, who started the company with me, we always liked telling stories and being creative in that respect. And and I think there's that urge to be part of the mythology and create your own story. We would create. We had I think we started Warhammer Fantasy Battles 2nd edition. So we started before 40,000 come out. I remember the White Dwarf that showed the first 40,000 stuff, and I thought, "Oh, this is a game changer. This could be interesting." But again, but there's a creative side to each side. In that, I would create an army. And my brother would create an army. We customize them based on the different, characters and heroics. The heroes and things in there, and then see how much of a mess you've made of your army. The last time we haven't played for a while. Last time we played Fantasy Battle, we haven't played Sigmar, but we still play Fantasy Battle now and again. It was the Empire versus the Undead, and just. And my undead was slowly just getting completely blown away by all the Empire riflemen and everything else. And I was just, in the end, relying on a necromancer that was slowly, watching all these troops age as they came towards me and then die. And I was just relentlessly trying to, So there was this little story coming together as you did it. But I think, the creativity can really hamper the overall strategy and tactics that. Of the game when you get there, and you suddenly find out I've made a right pig's ear of this, and I've got to go back to the drawing board and redo my army.
Yeah, those of us who play for the story often find that we end up on the losing side of any given tactical challenge. Yeah, that is inevitable. John, what about you?
Yeah, for me, I think it's, to begin with, when I was younger anyway, it was the collection and the displaying of the figures, I guess. And then from that, I guess, in our game, we tried to very much add a collection sense to it. So you collect warlords, you collect troops and stuff, and just drawing on such a rich IP where there's there's the many different forms of Warhammer now in terms of like books and obviously tabletop and like multiple digital games and multiple properties. I mean, I'm very engrossed in that world, both professionally and personally. I mean, I even paint while I'm listening to audiobooks, so I don't know if you can get any, we date both sorts of content at the same time. So for me, it's about the collection. I do understand a lot of people enjoy the very tactical nature of these games, and I think we've definitely tried to capture the tactical nature within our game. Like I said, we've got like a huge array of stats, and there's a huge a meta game within our title. And then I mean, I think the grand spectacle is definitely something that that's even more so, right? Coming together with your friends and seeing, we've built a community around our game, and I guess we're just going to continue to try and grow that.
No, I suppose the advantage with an MMO like that is the capacity to build towards that grand spectacle aspect of war games is unlimited, really. And I think again of these. I mean, again, I wouldn't call it a war game, but you think about the great sort of battle events of games like World of Warcraft, where thousands of players came together to fight through a particular story point. Or, again, the same with EVE Online, that hundreds of players will form fleets and take on another fleet of enemy in some great explosive event. Jan, what about you?
I was thinking about that. I mean, I think one of the things I like about it is and it kind of feeds into that grand spectacle thing, is kind of the power level of it. I've just realized I'm a control freak apparently, because I like the fact that I can control almost every aspect of it, and then I have to use my wits to go against the enemy, instead of running around in an RPG or in a first-person shooter where you like incrementally become more important, but initially you're off to hunting rats and more rats. This I think is quite attractive to me, that it always seems important. It makes what I do important because it concerns like a whole area of things. It concerns a population or a nation or something. I think that is what attracted me to it. It's crunchy, so you've like there's a lot of meat. You can replay, you can choose different tactics, you can try different ways of doing things. And as I become older, I also find, for the digital space, I find it quite attractive that it's slow. I lose Fortnite against my 12-year-old because my reaction is just too bad by now. And I really can't be bothered with all the gamepad controls. But I can understand complex rules, and I can beat him in these areas. So in order to be able to beat my 12-year-old, I do enjoy Wargames as well.
That certainly doesn't
I've got no pride left at that point, obviously.
We're drawing our way towards a close, and we've sort of covered over a lot of the meat of what I'd hoped to talk about. But to sort of perhaps finish us off, obviously we've all had a chance to talk about the games that we're working on, and we've mentioned and referred to a few games that may have sort of influenced or inspired us over the years. But I was wondering if you would each think about one or two classic games that you would like to recommend that the audience play that are not designed by you or sold by your companies. And when I say classic games, I mean, it's amazing to me that I can mean digital games as well as tabletop games now, that the digital market is now so mature and well embedded that we can talk about games within that market as being classics. So think for yourselves, take a moment. I'm going to put one of you on the spot in a second. If you can think of a couple of games that you would recommend to our audience that they should try, be they tabletop or digital at all. And I'm going to turn to James first, as he has as many games as possible behind him. I feel confident that he's going to have the best possible answer. Go
on. For a slightly different experience, we have been playing Root for those as a tabletop game, and that's fantastic. It's an asymmetric game, so everybody has their own ridiculous abilities. They're all, you play different animals. It's basically like Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham, and so the Marquis the Cat covers the board in troops, but then the Woodland Alliance have to sow dissent in all of the different areas in order to build up strength. And one player plays the Vagabond, which is one solitary character that goes around questing like a little RPG character that's got his own agenda, basically. And tactically, it is very it feels like it's a war game but with cute little animals, but on a board. So it's a really cool something really different to try, and thoroughly recommend that. I've been playing my favourites, the Eyrie, which are the old guard bird rulers of the woodland that have been deposed by the cat, and they have very rigid rules that they have to follow in order to complete their to actually win. And if they can't follow the rules, then they go into turmoil, and the whole system is revised and changed, and you have to go again and try. So you basically make political promises at the beginning that eventually you're not going to be able to keep, and then it all just collapses on. You have to start again. So yeah, very different and really cool. Good fun to try.
Excellent. What about you, Jan? Where would you go?
I do like Root as well. I also play the Eyrie, so many a times I've failed my program.
I've never heard of it, so I'm definitely going to have to go.
It's nice because it's one of the things that it's because it's asymmetrical. It's also, you don't have too many moves, so you're paying for mistakes that you make early on. You're paying a lot later on. It's a good study in how to build up consequence and action, which in a lot of war games that have a lot more units aren't as pronounced. I wouldn't recommend to anyone, but I still always go back to Advanced Squad Leader.
Yeah.
I've got these memories of having a room, a map the size of a room, and like 200 units on the Eastern Front, and taking ages for everything to actually get moving there. But what I liked about it is that it was at a point where the complexity was so, or the amount of units were so high that you couldn't possibly keep everything in view. And I actually still think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of the rule balancing. I wouldn't recommend perhaps in this day and age playing it because it's really clunky, but it's definitely like if you go through it, you're not scared by any other game anymore.
Well, I'll tell you, it's funny you should say you wouldn't recommend that people play it, because I have a grudge against Advanced Squad Leader, because a collection of supplementary material for ASL kept Zero Dark from the #1 bestseller list at Wargame Vault for a solid 2 months. And so I am yet to forgive Advanced Squad Leader, but that was, I mean, there are still people out there playing it and hungry for material. Astonishing as it may seem.
It's a lifestyle. It's not a game anymore at that point.
That's and a cult, I think, as well.
It is,
a little bit like BattleTech in that respect.
Yeah.
John, what about you? What would you recommend that our listeners check out?
I think back when I started Warhammer 40k, I think I was like 12, so that was like the only game I could afford. So the game that I played was on PC, and it's a real-time strategy game, and it was Command & Conquer, and they just remastered it recently, and I think it came out in 1995 originally, and I think it's just a great strategy game. I think I've been playing it, actually, the remaster, and it's held up reasonably well. I mean, the pathfinding is a bit terrible, but, I mean, it is what it is for a 25-year-old game now. So, I don't have anything really tabletop to talk about, just Command & Conquer on the PC.
Oh, I mean, it's a classic of its genre, and I think Command & Conquer might have been one of those first digital games that was a real feeder into the tabletop gaming community, that people were playing it, and that experience of moving units around that sort of battlefield environment that you had in the game really transitioned very well to the tabletop hobby, and I think it may have drawn a lot of people over to Warhammer. Well, as the moderator of the discussion, I am going to claim the final word on the subject. And as a tabletop designer, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Games Workshop, because on the one hand, they are the ones whose presence has made the tabletop wargame hobby an industry in which other companies can exist. But on the other hand, that it's also like trying to occupy a very small room shared with a very large elephant. And yet, despite that love-hate relationship, I am going to recommend that our audience check out one of their games. Now, this game is out of print, but you can still find fan versions online. I think you can even find PDFs of the original game online if you go and look. And it's Epic 40,000. I started my tabletop gaming journey with Space Marine, which was a 6mm battle game that partnered with Adeptus Titanicus to bring this massive game experience to the tabletop. And Epic 40,000 was the second version of that drew in Titans and Space Marines and Imperial Guard and Eldar all into a single massive battlefield experience. And what stayed with me from that is how the game indicated stress and damage on a unit in the game with these little three-dimensional cardboard blast markers that were placed around the unit. And it was such a simple but elegant solution that was visually appealing, and it was haptically appealing, and it just had this love aesthetic aspect to an absolutely core mechanical element of the board game. And it was such an elegant solution that I'd almost, maybe not quite, but I'd almost trace back my fascination with elegant tabletop game design right back to that single mechanic. So that brings us to a close. I would like to thank all of the members of the panel for their contribution to our conversation today. I would like to give them all one more opportunity just to say both who they are and what they're working on so that everybody who is watching can go and check that out. And something I forgot to say at the beginning is that underneath this broadcast, you should find links to the sites for all of our participants, including myself, if you want to check out anything that we are currently working on or anything that we are currently making available for sale through Steam or through some other medium. So we'll start with James. Go on.
Yeah, I'm James, director of Evil Twin Artworks, and our current game is Victory at Sea Pacific, but our next game, which should hopefully be launching soon, is Victory at Sea Ironclad, which is set in the American Civil War.
Jan.
I'm Jan Wagner. I'm running Owned by Gravity, and our recent game is Fantasy General 2, and we've just probably today or the day before launched the add-on, which is called Empire Flame, and you can buy that on Steam or in any good digital store.
And John.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It was lovely to meet all you guys. I'm John from Hunted Cow. We're obviously working on Warhammer Chaos and Conquest, and you can grab that on Steam right now.
And I am Robey Jenkins, and I run Precinct Omega, and my current product available from wargamevault.com is Horizon Wars Zero Dark, which is a miniatures agnostic science fiction skirmish game set in a post-apocalyptic world, because all the best games are set in post-apocalyptic worlds. Thank you very much to all my panel members for all of your contributions. Thank you very much to our audience for listening to everything we had to say. I hope you will have found that all of our panel members were in the chat to answer any questions that you had or to add any details that you might have wanted us to expand on in the conversation after this broadcast. So thank you very much for coming, everybody, and we're going to wind it up there.